The radio crackled once, then went silent. Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez stared at the communication device in her hand, its green display showing nothing but static interference. 3 clicks southeast of Forward Operating Base Crawford, the mountainous terrain of eastern Afghanistan swallowed radio signals like a hungry beast. She had been monitoring emergency frequencies for the past 18 hours, stationed at the medical aid post while the main strike team pushed deeper into Taliban-controlled territory. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Behind her, the aid station hummed with controlled chaos. Medics moved between canvas stretchers, their boots creating soft impressions in the packed dirt floor. The smell of antiseptic mixed with dust and the metallic tang of medical equipment. Elena's tactical vest hung loose around her shoulders, the weight of her field medical kit pulling at her left side. She had requested permission to accompany the forward reconnaissance unit that morning. The request had been denied without explanation. General Marcus Hayes stood near the command tent, his weathered face illuminated by the blue glow of multiple computer screens. His aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Brennan, hovered nearby, with a tablet, occasionally pointing at digital maps that showed real-time positions of their scattered units. The general's jaw was set in a familiar line of concentration, the same expression Elena had observed during countless briefings over the past 6 months. What none of them knew yet was that 23 miles northeast of their position, Second Lieutenant Michael Hayes, the general's only son, lay unconscious behind a fallen boulder, his patrol unit scattered by an improvised explosive device that had torn through their convoy like paper. The blast had separated him from his team, leaving him bleeding and alone in territory where American soldiers were shot on sight. Elena adjusted the frequency dial on her radio, searching for any trace of the missing patrol. The official mission status listed Lieutenant Hayes's unit as temporarily out of contact, military language that meant everything and nothing. She had seen that designation before. Sometimes it meant equipment failure. Sometimes it meant weather interference. And sometimes it meant something much worse that the aid station operated under strict protocols. Medical personnel remained at designated coordinates unless specifically ordered forward. Elena understood the logic. Losing medical assets in forward positions could compromise the entire operation's ability to treat wounded soldiers. But understanding the logic didn't make it easier to accept when she could hear the faint sound of distant explosions echoing through the mountain passes. She had trained for forward medical evacuation scenarios at Fort Sam Houston, where instructors emphasized the critical importance of rapid response in hostile environments. The difference between life and death often measured in minutes, not hours. Every second spent waiting for official clearance was a second that could determine whether a wounded soldier made it home alive. The general's voice carried across the compound as he spoke into his headset, coordinating with higher command elements back at Bagram Airfield. His tone remained steady, professional, but Elena caught the slight tension in his shoulders. She had learned to read the subtle signs of stress in commanding officers during her 3 deployments. Small details that revealed the human cost of military decision-making. Near the perimeter fence, Specialist James Morrison cleaned his rifle for the 3rd time that hour. The young soldier from Ohio had been assigned to base security after taking shrapnel in his left leg during a patrol 2 weeks earlier. He moved with a slight limp, favoring his right side when he thought no one was watching. Elena had treated his wounds and cleared him for limited duty, but she could see the way he tested his weight distribution when he walked. "Any word from Recon 7? Morrison asked, settling down beside Elena's position. His question was casual, but his eyes held the same concern that had been building in the compound throughout the day. "Nothing yet," Elena replied, not looking up from her radio. "Command says they're pushing through a communications dead zone." Morrison nodded, accepting the explanation because questioning it wouldn't change anything. But Elena had studied the topographical maps extensively. The area where Recon 7 was operating didn't have significant terrain features that would justify complete radio silence for this duration. Something else was happening out there. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the compound as temperatures began their gradual descent toward evening. In 6 hours, darkness would make any rescue operation exponentially more dangerous. Night vision equipment provided advantages, but it also leveled the playing field for enemy fighters, who knew the terrain intimately and could move through mountain passes without electronic assistance. Elena's medical training had taught her to think in terms of triage priorities and resource allocation. Every decision carried weight. Every action had consequences that rippled through the entire mission structure. But her instincts as a soldier instincts, honed through years of combat experience, told her that waiting for official authorization might mean waiting too long. She opened her field medical kit and conducted a systematic inventory check. Trauma, bandages, hemostatic agents, morphine autoinjectors, airway management supplies. Everything organized according to the rapid response protocols she had memorized and practiced until they became muscle memory. The kit contained enough supplies to stabilize multiple casualties during a prolonged engagement. As she worked, Elena's mind automatically calculated extraction routes and timelines, the terrain between their position and the last known coordinates of Recon 7 was challenging, but not impossible for a single person moving light and fast. She had traversed similar territory during her previous deployment in the Helmand province, where medical evacuation often required improvisation and individual initiative. The radio crackled again, this time producing a brief burst of static that might have contained human voices. Elena adjusted the antenna position and cycled through emergency frequencies, but the interference returned to its steady background hiss. She glanced toward the command tent, where General Hayes continued his coordination calls with increasing intensity. The sun hung lower now, painting the eastern mountains in shades of amber and deep purple. Soon, the decision window would close entirely. Elena checked her watch. 1647 hours. In military operations, timing was everything. Every minute that passed reduced the probability of a successful outcome, regardless of how skilled or motivated the rescue personnel might be. Around the compound, other soldiers went about their assigned duties with the practiced efficiency of a well-trained unit. Equipment was maintained, perimeters were monitored, and communication protocols were followed exactly as prescribed. But Elena could sense the underlying tension that came when professional soldiers knew that some of their own were missing in hostile territory. She stood up, stretching muscles that had grown stiff from hours of monitoring radio traffic. Her decision was already forming, though she hadn't yet acknowledged it consciously. Sometimes the right choice became clear not through careful analysis, but through the simple recognition that inaction was unacceptable. The general's son was somewhere out there, possibly wounded, definitely alone. Standard procedure demanded patience and adherence to command authority. But Elena Rodriguez had not survived 3 combat deployments by always following standard procedure. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Elena Rodriguez had earned her reputation the hard way. Born in San Antonio to a family of auto mechanics, she had joined the Army at 19 with nothing but a high school diploma and an unshakable belief that she could make a difference. 7 years later, she wore the Combat Medic Badge with 3 overseas service ribbons, each representing months of treating wounded soldiers under fire. Her hands, scarred from shrapnel fragments during a mortar attack in Iraq, moved with the precision of someone who had learned to work while the world exploded around her. The other medics at FOB Crawford respected her competence but found her intensity difficult to navigate. She didn't participate in the evening card games or join the informal discussions about home. Instead, Elena spent her off-duty hours studying advanced trauma protocols and memorizing the medical histories of every soldier in their area of operations. She knew that Corporal Davidson was allergic to penicillin, that Sergeant Walsh had a history of internal bleeding, and that Private Chun carried an emergency inhaler for asthma triggered by dust exposure. What Elena didn't know was how deeply. Her methodical approach irritated Major Richard Stanton, the senior medical officer who ran the aid station with bureaucratic precision. Stanton had earned his commission through officer candidate school after completing medical school at Duke University. He understood military medicine as a system of protocols and procedures, each designed to minimize risk and maximize efficiency. Elena's tendency to anticipate problems and propose solutions outside the established framework made him uncomfortable. Rodriguez operates like she's running her own private war. Stanton had complained to Lieutenant Colonel Brennan during their weekly briefing the previous Thursday. She requests information above her clearance level and submits equipment requisitions without proper authorization channels. Brennan had nodded politely while thinking that Elena's proactive approach was exactly what kept soldiers alive in unpredictable situations. But military hierarchies existed for reasons beyond simple power. Structures. Chain of command provided clarity during chaos, ensuring that decisions were made by personnel with access to complete intelligence pictures rather than fragmentary battlefield observations. The contrast between Elena's background and that of Second Lieutenant Michael Hayes illustrated the complex social dynamics that existed within military units. Hayes had graduated from West Point the previous spring, where he had excelled in leadership courses and tactical studies. His academic achievements reflected genuine intelligence and dedication, but his practical experience remained theoretical. He had requested assignment to a combat zone specifically to prove himself worthy of the family military tradition. General Hayes had built his career through a combination of strategic thinking and political awareness that had carried him through multiple overseas assignments. He understood that personal relationships and military effectiveness sometimes conflicted in ways that required difficult choices. When his son had volunteered for forward reconnaissance duty, the general had neither encouraged nor discouraged the decision. Michael was 22 years old and needed to establish his own professional identity separate from his father's influence. The missing patrol represented more than just a tactical setback for the general's command. It embodied the fundamental tension between protecting individual soldiers and accomplishing strategic objectives. Every decision to commit resources for search and rescue operations meant reducing assets available for other missions. Military mathematics required commanders to weigh probability of success against potential costs, often resulting in choices that prioritized the needs of many over the needs of few. Elena had observed these calculations during previous deployments, watching as senior officers struggled with decisions that balanced human compassion against operational reality. She had learned to read the signs of moral conflict in commanding officers' faces, the slight hesitation before issuing orders that might send more soldiers into danger. Leadership required accepting responsibility for outcomes that couldn't be controlled or predicted. The afternoon briefing took place in the main command tent, where digital displays showed real-time positions of friendly forces throughout the operational area. Elena stood at the back with other enlisted personnel, listening as intelligence officers updated the tactical situation with clinical detachment. Enemy activity had increased throughout the region, with reports of improvised explosive devices and small arms ambushes targeting coalition patrols. Recon 7's last communication placed them here. Captain Jennifer Walsh indicated a position on the topographical display. Grid coordinates 42, SMT-1, 589239847. They were investigating reports of weapons caches in these ridgeline caves. Elena memorized the coordinates automatically, cross-referencing them with her mental map of the surrounding terrain. The position was approximately 21 miles northeast of their current location, accessible through a series of mountain trails that wound through valleys controlled by Taliban forces. Standard extraction protocols would require helicopter support, but the weather forecast showed incoming cloud cover that would ground aircraft until the following morning. Major Stanton raised his hand and asked about casualty estimates. Intelligence officer responded that no distress signals had been received, suggesting either equipment failure or enemy interference with communication systems. Elena noted that the briefing carefully avoided discussing the possibility that Recon 7 had been captured or killed, though that scenario was clearly being considered by the command staff. General Hayes listened to the updates without expression, his weathered hands folded behind his back. Elena had learned to recognize the general's thinking posture during previous briefings, the way he processed information before making decisions that would affect the lives of soldiers under his command. She respected his methodical approach. Even when she disagreed with his conclusions, the general's aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Colonel Brennan, had served with distinction during multiple combat deployments before accepting her current assignment. Her organizational skills and tactical knowledge made her invaluable for coordinating complex operations involving multiple units and support elements. Elena had worked with Brennan during a mass casualty event 6 weeks earlier, when a suicide bomber had attacked a convoy returning from patrol. Brennan's calm efficiency had helped coordinate medical evacuation for 14 wounded soldiers. After the briefing concluded, Elena remained in the tent while other personnel returned to their duties. She approached the digital display and studied the terrain features around Recon 7's last known position. The mountains in that region were characterized by steep slopes and narrow valleys that channeled movement along predictable routes. Anyone attempting to reach the missing patrol would need to navigate through areas where enemy observation posts could monitor approaches from multiple directions. The tactical challenge was significant, but not insurmountable for someone with appropriate training and equipment. Elena had completed the Army's Combat Lifesaver course and Advanced Field Medical Training, both of which included modules on operating independently in hostile environments. She understood how to move through dangerous terrain while carrying medical supplies sufficient to treat multiple casualties. As evening approached, the atmosphere at Forward Crawford grew increasingly tense. Soldiers went about their assigned duties with mechanical efficiency, but conversations were muted and laughter was absent. Everyone understood that time was running out for Recon 7, though no one spoke the words aloud. Military culture discouraged open discussion of worst-case scenarios, instead emphasizing positive thinking and mission focus. Elena checked her personal equipment one final time, ensuring that her medical kit contained everything necessary for emergency trauma treatment in field conditions. Her rifle was clean and properly zeroed, her ammunition was organized for rapid access, and her night vision equipment had been tested and calibrated. She had learned through experience that preparation was the foundation of survival in combat zones. The decision that would change everything was already forming in her mind, though she had not yet committed to action. Sometimes moral clarity emerged not through careful analysis, but through the simple recognition that some choices were more important than others. Elena Rodriguez had not survived 3 combat deployments by always following orders when those orders conflicted with her duty to save lives. While the command staff gathered for their evening strategy session, Elena methodically prepared for possibilities they weren't discussing. In the supply tent, she requisitioned additional trauma bandages under the pretense of restocking the aid station's emergency reserves. Sergeant First Class Robert Kim, the supply NCO, barely glanced at her paperwork before stamping the authorization. Elena had built a reputation for meticulous inventory management, and her requests were rarely questioned. The extra supplies disappeared into her personal gear bag alongside items that wouldn't appear on any official manifest. A compact bolt cutter borrowed from the engineering section, extra ammunition magazines that she signed out for training purposes, a backup GPS unit that she had purchased with her own money during leave in Germany. Each item was selected based on scenarios that official planning documents classified as low-probability events. Elena's preparation differed fundamentally from the methodical planning taking place in the command tent. While staff officers developed contingency plans based on available intelligence and established procedures, she focused on individual survival skills and improvised solutions. Her approach reflected hard-earned knowledge about the gap between theoretical planning and battlefield reality. In the maintenance bay, she inspected the personal equipment that would determine her survival if she ended up alone in hostile territory. Her body armor had been modified with additional plate inserts that provided extra protection while remaining light enough for extended movement. Her boots were broken in properly, the leather soft and flexible after months of daily wear. Her uniform had been treated with IR suppressant, chemicals that would reduce her heat signature to thermal imaging devices. The tactical radio she carried was a newer model than the standard issue equipment, with encryption capabilities and extended battery life. Elena had traded her monthly beer ration to a communications specialist in exchange for the upgraded unit. She understood that maintaining contact with friendly forces could mean the difference between successful extraction and permanent disappearance in enemy territory. As darkness settled over Forward Crawford, Elena conducted her final equipment check with the systematic thoroughness of someone whose life depended on attention to detail. Her medical kit contained enough supplies to treat multiple gunshot wounds, including hemostatic agents that could stop arterial bleeding within minutes. Her weapon was loaded with hollow-point ammunition that would provide maximum stopping power, while minimizing the risk of over-penetration in close-quarters combat. The night vision goggles she had acquired through unofficial channels offered superior clarity compared to standard military-issue equipment. During her previous deployment, Elena had learned that technological advantages could compensate for numerical disadvantages when operating alone in hostile territory. Superior equipment often meant the difference between completing a mission and becoming another casualty statistic. Meanwhile, in the command tent, Major Stanton presented his analysis of medical evacuation options to the assembled staff. His PowerPoint presentation included detailed charts showing helicopter response times, weather windows, and casualty treatment protocols. Everything was organized according to established procedures that had been developed through years of military medical experience. Current atmospheric conditions will ground rotary wing aircraft until 0630 hours tomorrow, Stanton explained, highlighting weather data on the main display screen. Any medical evacuation before that time would require ground-based transport through unsecured territory. General Hayes studied the presentation with the focused attention of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions based on incomplete information. His expression revealed nothing about his personal investment in the missing patrol, maintaining the professional detachment that military leadership required. Elena watched from the back of the tent, noting the slight tension in the general's jaw that suggested internal conflict between his roles as commander and father. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan added tactical considerations to the medical analysis, explaining how enemy activity patterns limited their options for ground-based rescue operations. Intelligence reports indicated increased Taliban movement throughout the region, with multiple ambush sites identified along the most direct routes to Recon 7's last known position. Our options are essentially threefold, Brennan summarized. Wait for weather clearance and conduct helicopter extraction. Commit a full company to ground-based search and rescue. Or maintain current positions and hope Recon 7 can reach friendly lines independently. Elena understood the unspoken implications of each option. Helicopter extraction was the safest approach for rescue personnel, but required waiting until morning, when survivors might be dead from untreated injuries. Ground-based rescue with company-level support would likely succeed, but would commit significant resources to an operation with uncertain outcomes. Waiting for self-extraction placed the entire burden on missing soldiers, who might lack the capability to reach safety independently. What the official planning process couldn't accommodate was the fourth option that Elena was contemplating: individual infiltration by someone with specialized medical training and minimal resource requirements. Her approach would violate multiple standing orders and could result in court-martial proceedings if discovered. But it offered the best probability of reaching casualties within the critical treatment window. As the evening briefing continued, Elena slipped out of the command tent and made her way to the communications bunker. Specialist Rebecca Martinez was monitoring radio frequencies from multiple units across the operational area, her headphones plugged into equipment that could intercept enemy transmissions as well as friendly communications. "Any traffic from Recon 7's frequency?" Elena asked quietly. Martinez shook her head without looking away from her monitoring equipment. "Nothing since 1430 hours. Could be equipment failure, could be atmospheric interference, could be..." She didn't finish the sentence, but Elena understood the implications. Elena studied the frequency logs that Martinez maintained in a handwritten notebook. The pattern of communications from other units showed normal operational chatter throughout the day, suggesting that atmospheric conditions weren't causing widespread interference. Recon 7's silence was an anomaly that couldn't be explained by environmental factors. In the motor pool, Elena checked the maintenance status of vehicles that might be available for unauthorized use. The Humvees were secured with steering wheel locks and required keys that were controlled by the motor sergeant. But two motorcycles used for message delivery between outposts sat unguarded near the maintenance bay. Elena had learned to operate similar vehicles during her training at Fort Benning, where mobility exercises required improvisation with available transportation. Her reconnaissance revealed both opportunities and obstacles for independent action. The perimeter fence could be breached at several points where recent mortar attacks had damaged the razor wire. Guard posts followed predictable patterns that created brief windows of reduced observation. Vehicle patrols maintained radio contact that could be monitored to avoid detection, but Elena also recognized the enormous risks associated with unauthorized departure from the base. Court-martial proceedings would be the least serious consequence if she was discovered. More likely, she would be killed by enemy forces or die from exposure in mountain terrain that showed no mercy to unprepared travelers. Military regulations existed to prevent exactly the kind of individual heroics that she was contemplating. As midnight approached, Elena made her final decision. She had spent hours analyzing tactical options and preparing equipment for multiple scenarios. Her training and experience provided confidence that she could reach Recon 7's last known position and provide medical treatment if survivors were found. The probability of success was low, but it was higher than the probability of success if no action was taken. She wrote a brief letter explaining her actions and placed it in her personal locker, where it would eventually be discovered. The letter didn't contain apologies or justifications, only a clear statement of her reasoning and a request that her family be notified if she didn't return. Elena Rodriguez had learned that some decisions couldn't be explained to people who hadn't faced similar choices. At 0130 hours, while the base settled into the quiet rhythm of night watch, Elena gathered her equipment and prepared to leave everything familiar behind. Her modified gear weighed 43 pounds, light enough for extended movement, but heavy enough to provide everything necessary for survival in hostile territory. She had calculated distances, planned routes, and identified contingency options. For every scenario she could imagine, the most dangerous part of her plan was the next 15 minutes, when she would have to leave FOB Crawford without being detected by friendly forces. After that, she would face Taliban fighters, treacherous mountain terrain, and the possibility that Recon 7 was already beyond help. But Elena had spent 7 years preparing for exactly this kind of mission, even if she had never imagined. Undertaking it alone. Dawn broke gray and cold over Forward Crawford, the mountain air carrying the scent of diesel fuel and brewing coffee. At 0600 hours, General Hayes called an emergency briefing that would determine the fate of Recon 7. The command tent filled quickly with staff officers, unit commanders, and senior enlisted personnel, their faces showing the strain of a sleepless night spent monitoring radio, frequencies that remained ominously silent. Elena stood near the equipment lockers at the back of the tent, her position carefully chosen to observe without drawing attention. She had returned from her midnight reconnaissance of the perimeter, having decided to wait for the morning briefing before taking irreversible action. The information presented during this meeting would either confirm her worst fears about Recon 7's situation or provide reasons to trust the official response. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan began with an intelligence update that painted an increasingly grim picture. Satellite imagery showed evidence of recent explosive activity at coordinates matching Recon 7's planned route. Infrared scans detected vehicle movement patterns consistent with Taliban quick reaction forces converging on the Infrared scans detected vehicle movement patterns consistent with Taliban quick reaction forces converging on the Farfan area. Most concerning, signals intelligence had intercepted enemy communications referencing the capture of American soldiers. At 0347 hours, NSA assets monitoring Taliban frequencies recorded a transmission mentioning American prisoners, Brennan reported, her voice maintaining professional calm despite the implications. The transmission was encrypted and brief, but linguistic analysis suggests it originated from the same region where Recon 7 went missing. General Hayes absorbed this information without visible reaction, though Elena noticed his hands tighten slightly behind his back. The general had commanded troops in combat for over 20 years, long enough to understand that capture by Taliban forces meant torture, propaganda videos, and eventual execution. The window for successful rescue was measured in hours, not days. Major Stanton presented the medical assessment with bureaucratic precision that seemed almost insulting given the circumstances. He explained casualty evacuation timelines, trauma treatment protocols, and resource allocation procedures as if the missing soldiers were statistical abstractions rather than human beings bleeding out in enemy territory. Standard medical evacuation procedures require secure landing zones and air superiority, Stanton stated, clicking through slides that showed helicopter approach routes and defensive positions. Current atmospheric conditions continue to prevent rotary wing operations until at least 0800 hours. Elena wanted to interrupt with the observation that standard procedures were designed for routine operations, not desperate rescue attempts where minutes could determine survival. But speaking out of turn during a general's briefing would result in immediate disciplinary action and removal from the tent. She forced herself to remain silent while listening to discussions that seemed disconnected from battlefield reality. Captain Walsh, the intelligence officer, provided detailed analysis of enemy force disposition throughout the region. Taliban units had increased their activity significantly since Recon 7's disappearance, suggesting either coincidental timing or deliberate response to American presence in their operational area. Multiple roadblocks had been established along primary escape routes, and communications intercepts indicated heightened alert status among enemy fighters. Hostile forces appear to be conducting coordinated search operations, Walsh explained, manipulating the digital map display to show enemy movement patterns. They've positioned blocking forces here, and here, effectively sealing off the most likely extraction corridors. The tactical picture that emerged from the intelligence briefing was deeply troubling. Recon 7 was wrapped in territory controlled by an enemy that was actively hunting American soldiers. Conventional rescue operations would require overwhelming force superiority, and extensive preparation time that casualties couldn't afford. Every hour of delay increased the probability that rescue attempts would find only bodies. General Hayes finally spoke, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected hundreds of lives. Gentlemen, we have limited options and less time. Weather services project a brief clearing window beginning at 0830 hours. That gives us approximately 90 minutes to plan and execute helicopter extraction. Elena felt her stomach tighten as she realized the general was committing to an approach that might arrive too late. Helicopter insertion would require extensive preparation, including suppressive fires, escort aircraft, and careful coordination with ground units. The earliest possible arrival time at Recon 7's position would be 0945 hours, nearly 20 hours after their last communication. Major Stanton raised concerns about medical preparedness for mass casualty situations. His questions focused on equipment manifests and personnel assignments, rather than the fundamental problem of reaching wounded soldiers before they died from untreated injuries. Elena listened to discussions about fluids and bandage inventories, while thinking about arterial bleeding that could kill someone in minutes. The briefing continued with detailed coordination procedures between air assets, ground units, and supporting elements. Everything was organized according to established doctrine that prioritized force protection and mission success over speed of execution. Elena understood the reasoning behind careful planning, but she also knew that military doctrine was written for situations where commanders had time to implement proper procedures. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan outlined the helicopter extraction plan with methodical precision. 2 Apache gunships would provide close air support, while a single Black Hawk conducted the actual recovery operation. Ground units would establish overwatch positions to secure the landing zone and provide suppressive fire if needed. The plan was tactically sound and properly coordinated, but it would take hours to implement. Timeline for mission execution shows departure at 0845 hours, with arrival at target location no earlier than 0930 hours, Brennan announced, highlighting the schedule on her presentation display. This assumes optimal weather conditions and no significant enemy interference. Elena performed rapid mental calculations that painted a disturbing picture. If Recon 7 had sustained casualties during their initial contact with enemy forces, 22 hours of untreated injuries would likely prove fatal for anyone with serious wounds. Shock, blood loss, and exposure to mountain temperatures created a medical emergency that couldn't wait for properly coordinated rescue operations. As the briefing progressed, Elena noticed something that others seemed to be avoiding. No one mentioned Second Lieutenant Michael Hayes by name. The missing patrol was discussed in clinical terms as Recon 7, or personnel requiring extraction, but the fact that the general's son was among the missing soldiers remained unspoken. Military culture discouraged personal considerations from influencing tactical decisions, even when those considerations involved family relationships. The general concluded the briefing with orders that reflected standard operating procedures for personnel recovery operations. All units would maintain defensive positions while aviation assets prepared for the rescue mission. Medical personnel would remain at their assigned duty stations to treat casualties upon their return. No one was authorized to conduct independent operations outside the approved plan. I want complete communications discipline until mission completion, General Hayes emphasized, his gaze sweeping across the assembled personnel. No unauthorized departures from base, no freelance operations, and no deviations from established procedures. We execute this mission by the book, gentlemen. Elena understood that the general's final words were directed specifically at soldiers like her, personnel with the skills and motivation to attempt individual rescue operations. The warning was clear. Anyone who disobeyed orders would face serious consequences. But Elena also understood that following orders might mean watching fellow soldiers die while bureaucratic procedures played out in slow motion. As the briefing ended and personnel began filing out of the tent, Elena remained motionless. Near the equipment lockers, she had heard everything she needed to know about the official response to Recon 7's disappearance. The rescue mission was properly planned and adequately resourced, but it would arrive too late to save anyone with serious injuries. The choice facing Elena Rodriguez was simple in its clarity and devastating in its implications. She could follow orders, maintain military discipline, and trust that established procedures would somehow produce a successful outcome. Or she could violate direct commands from a general officer and attempt something that had never been officially authorized, a solo infiltration mission into enemy territory with minimal equipment and no support. Major Stanton approached her as the tent emptied, his expression showing mild irritation at her continued presence. "Rodriguez, you have duties at the aid station. Medical personnel are needed there, not here discussing tactical operations above their clearance level." Elena nodded respectfully and gathered her equipment, but her mind was already focused on preparations that Major Stanton couldn't imagine. She had approximately 2 hours before the official rescue mission departed. 2 hours to implement a plan that would either save lives or cost her everything she had spent 7 years building in military service. The morning sun climbed higher above the eastern mountains, illuminating terrain that held secrets about American soldiers who might already be dead. Elena Rodriguez walked toward the aid station with outward compliance while making final preparations for the most important decision of her military career. In 0742 hours, everything changed with a single intercepted radio transmission. "Specialist." Martinez burst into the aid station where Elena was conducting inventory checks, her face pale with urgency. "Rodriguez, you need to hear this," she whispered, glancing around to ensure they were alone. An SA picked up another Taliban communication. 15 minutes ago. "They're planning to move the prisoners before sunrise tomorrow." Elena's blood turned to ice. Moving prisoners meant execution or transfer to a location where rescue would become impossible. The Taliban had learned from previous American operations that holding captives near their original positions invited overwhelming military response. Standard procedure was to transport high-value prisoners to secure compounds deep in Pakistan, where they would disappear forever into the black sites of international terrorism. Martinez continued in hushed tones. The transmission included specific references to the officer's son. They know exactly who they have, and they're planning to use him for maximum propaganda value before. She didn't finish the sentence, but Elena understood the implications. Second Lieutenant Michael Hayes wasn't just another missing soldier anymore. He had become a strategic asset for an enemy that specialized in psychological warfare against American families. The Taliban would milk every possible advantage from their capture of a general's son, starting with propaganda videos and ending with public execution designed to demoralize American forces throughout the region. Elena checked her watch. 0745 hours. The official rescue mission wouldn't depart for another hour. An arrival at the target location was scheduled for 0930 at the earliest. If the Taliban planned to move prisoners before dawn the following day, they would likely begin transportation around midnight to allow sufficient travel time to secure facilities. That left approximately 16 hours for successful rescue, but only if someone could reach the prisoners before the move began. The mathematics of survival were brutal and unforgiving. Michael Hayes and any other survivors from Recon 7 were almost certainly wounded from the initial attack that had scattered their patrol. Without proper medical treatment, serious injuries would prove fatal within hours rather than days. Internal bleeding, shock, and infection created medical emergencies that couldn't wait for properly coordinated rescue operations. Elena made her decision with the clarity that came from understanding that inaction was morally unacceptable. She would violate direct orders from General Hayes, risk court-martial proceedings, and attempt something that military doctrine classified as tactically unsound: solo infiltration into enemy territory with minimal support and no authorization. First step was equipment acquisition without triggering official notice. Elena had already assembled most of what she needed during her midnight preparations, but additional supplies would improve her chances of mission success. In the pharmacy section of the aid station, she signed out emergency medical supplies. Using authorization codes that would be questioned only during routine audits weeks later, morphine auto-injectors, hemostatic agents, and trauma bandages disappeared into her personal kit alongside antibiotics and 4 fluids that could stabilize critical patients during extended transport. Elena had learned during previous deployments that individual medical loads needed to balance treatment capability against mobility requirements. Too much equipment would slow her movement through dangerous terrain. Too little would leave her unable to save lives, even if she successfully reached casualties. Her weapons preparation was equally methodical. Elena's M4 carbine had been modified, with a shorter barrel and collapsible stock that reduced overall length while maintaining accuracy at combat ranges. Her ammunition selection included hollow point rounds for maximum stopping power and tracer rounds for signaling purposes. Night vision equipment would provide tactical advantages during movement through unfamiliar territory. At 0810 hours, Elena implemented the most dangerous part of her plan: departure from FOB Crawford without detection by friendly forces. She had identified a breach point in the perimeter fence where recent mortar damage had created a gap large enough for individual passage. Guard rotations followed, predictable patterns that provided brief windows of reduced observation. Moving with the stealth techniques learned during combat training, Elena reached the fence line during a guard change that left the northeastern section unobserved for approximately 90 seconds. She slipped through the damaged wire and into the rocky terrain beyond the base perimeter, carrying 48 pounds of equipment organized for rapid access under fire. The mountain landscape stretched endlessly toward the northeast, its ridges and valleys holding secrets about missing American soldiers who might already be dead. Elena checked her GPS coordinates and began moving toward Recon 7's last known position, approximately 21 miles distant through territory controlled by an enemy that killed American soldiers on sight. Her route followed animal trails and dry creek beds that provided concealment from observation, while allowing reasonable movement speed across difficult terrain. Elena had studied topographical maps extensively, identifying waypoints and alternative routes that would minimize exposure to enemy surveillance. But map study couldn't prepare her for the physical reality of traversing mountain passes while carrying combat loads. The morning sun climbed higher, creating heat mirages that distorted distant terrain features and making accurate navigation increasingly difficult. Elena's GPS provided precise coordinates, but electronic equipment could fail or be detected by enemy signals intelligence capabilities. She relied on terrain association and dead reckoning techniques learned during survival training, using ridge lines and valley configurations to maintain directional orientation. After 2 hours of movement, Elena reached an observation point that provided visual access to the area where Recon 7 had disappeared. Through her binoculars, she could see evidence of recent explosive activity: blackened earth, scattered equipment, and vehicle tracks that indicated Taliban forces had investigated the site thoroughly. No American bodies were visible, suggesting either successful evacuation or capture of survivors. Elena's tactical assessment of the situation was sobering. Enemy forces controlled the high ground and had positioned observation posts that could detect movement across multiple approach routes. Any rescue attempt would require infiltration through areas where Taliban fighters held significant advantages in terrain knowledge and defensive preparation. The probability of mission success was low, but it was higher than the probability of success if no action was taken. Meanwhile, back at FOB Crawford, Elena's absence had been discovered during the 0900 Personnel Accountability Formation. Major Stanton reported to General Hayes that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was missing from her assigned duty station, and a quick search of her personal area revealed the letter she had left explaining her actions. General Hayes read Elena's letter with growing fury and grudging admiration. The fury came from her blatant violation of direct orders and unauthorized departure from base. The admiration came from her clear reasoning and professional assessment of the tactical situation. Elena Rodriguez was either completely insane or the only person willing to acknowledge that official procedures were inadequate for the current crisis. "Sir, we need to recall her immediately," Lieutenant Colonel Brennan advised, studying the letter over the general's shoulder. Unauthorized personnel in the operational area could compromise the entire rescue mission. General Hayes crumpled the letter in his fist, his jaw tight with barely controlled emotion. Elena's independent action had created a command crisis that could affect his military career and the lives of multiple soldiers. But she was also the only American currently moving toward his son's position with the medical skills necessary to keep wounded soldiers alive. "Track her movement and maintain communications monitoring," the general ordered. "But do not abort the official rescue mission. We proceed as planned." What General Hayes didn't say was that Elena Rodriguez might be Michael's only hope for survival. The official rescue mission was properly planned and adequately resourced, but it would arrive too late to save anyone with serious injuries. Elena's unauthorized mission violated every principle of military discipline, but it offered the best probability of reaching casualties within the critical treatment window. At 0930 hours, as helicopter rotors began spinning up for the official rescue mission, Elena Rodriguez was already 8 miles deep in enemy territory, moving steadily toward a confrontation that would determine whether General Hayes would see his son alive again. She had burned her bridges, violated her oath of obedience, and risked everything on a mission that military doctrine classified as tactically unsound. But sometimes the right choice couldn't be found in doctrine manuals or command procedures. Sometimes it required individual soldiers to make decisions that transcended regulations and risk, everything for principles that couldn't be quantified or analyzed. Elena Rodriguez had spent 7 years preparing for exactly this kind of moment, even if she had never imagined it would involve disobeying direct orders from a general officer whose son's life hung in the balance. 12 miles deep in Taliban territory, Elena discovered the first sign that Recon 7 had survived the initial attack. A torn fragment of American camouflage fabric hung from a thorn bush beside a narrow goat trail, placed deliberately at eye level where rescuers might notice it. The fabric was fresh, no more than 24 hours old, and positioned in a way that suggested intentional marking rather than accidental loss. Elena examined the surrounding area with methodical care, looking for additional signs that might indicate direction of movement or number of survivors. Boot prints in the soft earth showed American-made treads mixed with local footwear patterns, confirming that prisoners had been taken alive and moved through this position. Blood droplets on nearby rocks indicated at least one wounded person, but the spacing and volume suggested manageable injuries rather than life-threatening trauma. Following the trail required every tracking skill Elena had learned during survival training and 3 combat deployments. The Taliban fighters were experienced at moving through mountain terrain without leaving obvious traces, but they couldn't eliminate all evidence of passage when transporting wounded prisoners across rocky ground. Disturbed vegetation, displaced stones, and subtle changes in soil compression created a faint but readable trail for someone who knew how to interpret the signs. As Elena moved deeper into enemy territory, the terrain became increasingly treacherous. Narrow ridges dropped into sheer canyons where a single misstep would mean certain death. The altitude affected her breathing, and the weight of her equipment made every upward climb a test of physical endurance. But she maintained steady progress toward coordinates that her GPS indicated were still 8 miles distant. At 11:47 hours, Elena's advance was halted by the sound of voices speaking Pashto somewhere ahead on the trail. She immediately sought concealment behind a cluster of boulders and used her binoculars to scan the area for enemy positions. 2 Taliban fighters were visible on a ridge approximately 400 meters ahead, apparently conducting routine security patrol of the approach routes to their stronghold. Elena's tactical situation had become critically dangerous. The enemy fighters were positioned to observe the only practical route through this section of mountains, making further advance impossible without neutralizing their observation post. But engaging enemy forces would compromise her stealth mission and alert other Taliban units to American presence in their operational area. She studied the terrain for alternative approaches, using her military training to identify possibilities that civilian hikers would never consider. A steep ravine to the west offered potential bypass route, but it would require technical climbing skills and add hours to her movement time. A northern approach followed the exposed ridgeline that would leave her silhouetted against the sky for anyone with optical surveillance equipment. Elena chose the western ravine, accepting the time penalty in exchange for maintaining mission security. She secured her equipment for technical movement and began descending into the rocky gorge using mountaineering techniques learned during specialized training at Fort Carson. The descent was treacherous, requiring careful placement of hands and feet on unstable rock surfaces that could give way without warning. 2 hours later, after completing a harrowing climb that left her equipment damaged and her uniform torn, Elena emerged from the ravine at a position that bypassed the Taliban observation post. Her hands were bleeding from contact with sharp rocks, and her water consumption had exceeded planned levels due to the physical demands of technical climbing. But she had avoided detection and maintained her movement toward the target area. At 14:30 hours, Elena reached an elevation that provided visual access to the Taliban stronghold where Recon 7 was being held. Through her binoculars, she could see a small compound consisting of 3 stone buildings surrounded by defensive walls constructed from local materials. Guards were posted at obvious positions, and the layout suggested a facility designed for holding prisoners rather than conducting routine military operations. Elena's battlefield assessment revealed both opportunities and obstacles for a rescue attempt. The compound was positioned on elevated ground that provided defensive advantages but also created dead space where approaching forces could move undetected. Guard positions followed predictable patterns that created brief windows of reduced surveillance. Most importantly, she could see movement inside the compound that suggested prisoners were still alive and relatively mobile. The challenge was reaching the compound without alerting guards who would certainly execute prisoners at the first sign of rescue attempt. Elena needed to neutralize multiple enemy positions simultaneously, while maintaining surprise long enough to extract wounded soldiers who might be unable to move independently. The tactical problem required precision timing and aggressive action that left no margin for error. Elena spent 2 hours conducting detailed reconnaissance of guard patterns, defensive positions, and potential extraction routes. She identified 3 Taliban fighters positioned around the compound perimeter, with additional personnel likely inside the buildings. Her ammunition load included enough rounds to engage multiple targets, but sustained firefight would attract reinforcements that could overwhelm a single operator. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the mountain slopes, Elena implemented her assault plan with the methodical precision of someone whose survival depended on flawless execution. She approached the compound from the northeast, using terrain features to mask her movement while advancing to positions that would provide clear fields of fire against guard posts. At 16:47 hours, Elena initiated her attack with a single suppressed Rifle shot that dropped the first guard before he could raise an alarm. She immediately shifted position and engaged the second guard with another precise shot, neutralizing the threat while maintaining the element of surprise. The third guard detected movement and began raising his weapon, but Elena's third shot caught him center mass before he could fire. Elena sprinted toward the compound entrance, knowing that her advantage would last only minutes before other Taliban fighters responded to the absence of guard communications. She breached the wooden door with a kick that splintered the ancient timber and immediately swept the interior for threats, her rifle raised and ready to engage any enemy forces protecting the prisoners. Inside the main building, Elena found what she had risked everything to reach: Second Lieutenant Michael Hayes and 2 other members of Recon 7, all wounded but alive. Hayes was semi-conscious with a head injury that had left him disoriented and bleeding. Sergeant Tommy Chun had sustained a bullet wound through his left shoulder that was infected, but not immediately life-threatening. Private First Class David Martinez appeared to have internal injuries that required immediate medical attention. "Who are you?" Hayes mumbled through swollen lips, his vision too blurred to recognize Elena's uniform in the dim light of the stone building. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, medic," Elena replied while conducting rapid triage assessment of his injuries. "I'm here to get you home." Elena's medical training took over as she worked to stabilize 3 casualties for movement through hostile territory. Hayes received morphine for pain management and bandaging for his head wound. Chun's shoulder was cleaned and redressed with antibiotics to prevent further infection. Martinez received 4 fluids and pressure bandages for suspected internal bleeding that could prove fatal without surgical intervention. The sound of approaching vehicles echoed through the mountain valleys as Elena prepared her patients for extraction. Taliban reinforcements were responding to the absence of radio contact from the compound guards, and Elena had perhaps 15 minutes before overwhelming enemy forces arrived to recapture the prisoners. Elena helped Hayes to his feet, supporting his weight while he struggled to maintain balance. "Can you move, Lieutenant?" Hayes nodded weakly, drawing on reserves of determination that had carried him through West Point and sustained him during captivity. "I can move. Get my men out first." Elena understood that she faced an impossible choice between mission success and moral obligation. Evacuating 3 wounded soldiers through 20 miles of enemy territory was beyond the capability of a single operator, but leaving anyone behind meant condemning them to certain execution. She had approximately 14 minutes to devise a solution that military doctrine insisted was impossible. Sometimes the difference between success and failure came down to individual decisions made under pressure that revealed character in ways that peacetime service never could. Elena Rodriguez had spent 7 years preparing for this moment, though she had never imagined it would require choosing between following orders and saving lives. Now, surrounded by wounded soldiers in enemy territory with reinforcements approaching, she would discover whether her preparation was sufficient for the ultimate test of military service. With Taliban reinforcements closing in and 3 wounded soldiers depending on her, Elena made a decision that would redefine the meaning of impossible. She activated her emergency beacon, broadcasting her exact coordinates to every American listening post within range, then destroyed the device to prevent enemy tracking. The signal would bring help, but it would also bring overwhelming enemy response to her position. "We're moving in 60 seconds, Elena announced, helping Martinez to his feet while calculating loads and movement capabilities. "Hayes, you take point since you know the terrain. Chun, your rear security despite that shoulder. Martinez, stay between us and focus on keeping up." Elena distributed her equipment among the group, prioritizing weapons and medical supplies while abandoning everything non-essential. Her rifle went to Chun, who could still operate effectively with 1 functional arm. Hayes received her sidearm and the last of her ammunition. Elena kept only her medical kit and enough rounds to provide covering fire during their escape. Asterisk. The improvised squad moved out of the compound, just as the sound of approaching vehicles grew louder in the valley. Below, Elena led them toward a defensive position she had identified during her reconnaissance, a cluster of rocks that would provide concealment and clear fields of fire if they were forced to make a stand. Hayes struggled with each step, his head injury affecting his balance, but he maintained the pace through sheer determination. "Contact rear," Chun called out quietly, indicating Taliban fighters moving up the trail behind them. Elena estimated they had perhaps 5 minutes before enemy forces reached the compound and discovered the dead guards. After that, pursuit would be immediate and overwhelming. Elena's tactical radio crackled with an incoming transmission on emergency frequencies. Any station. This is Black Hawk 77 requesting grid coordinates for emergency signal. Over." Elena grabbed the radio and transmitted quickly. "Black Hawk 77. This is Staff Sergeant Rodriguez with 3 wounded personnel at grid. 42 SMT 1612440183. Require immediate extraction. Heavy enemy presence converging on position. Over." Asterisk. The response came back immediately. "Rodriguez, this is Black Hawk 77. Be advised, General Hayes sends his personal thanks and extraction authorization. 8A, your position 12 minutes. Can you hold that long?" Elena looked at her wounded charges and calculated their remaining combat effectiveness against the Taliban forces that would soon be hunting them. Hayes was barely conscious, Martinez was fighting shock from internal injuries, and Chun had one functional arm. Their ammunition was limited, their position was exposed, and enemy reinforcements included vehicles with heavy weapons. "Black Hawk 77, we'll hold as long as we can." Rodriguez out. Elena positioned her small team in the rocks with fields of fire covering the most likely enemy approach routes. She placed Hayes behind the largest boulder where his head injury wouldn't affect his ability to provide suppressive fire. Chun took an elevated position despite his wounded shoulder, using his rifle to cover the eastern approach. Martinez, despite his internal injuries, insisted on monitoring the western flank with Elena's binoculars. At 17:03 hours, the first Taliban fighters appeared on the trail below, moving cautiously as they investigated the abandoned compound. Elena held her fire, waiting for the enemy to commit to a direction of advance before revealing her position. Patience was critical when facing overwhelming numerical disadvantages. The Taliban fighters discovered the dead guards and immediately began searching for tracks that would reveal the direction of American escape. Elena watched through her scope as they organized into pursuit teams, their movements showing the tactical competence of experienced fighters who had survived years of combat against coalition forces. "They're splitting up," Elena whispered to her team. 2 groups, 8 men each, one going north, one coming straight at us. Hayes raised his weapon with shaking hands, the concussion still affecting his motor control. "Just tell me when to shoot." Elena waited until the approaching Taliban fighters were within effective range before initiating contact. Her first shot dropped the lead pursuer, causing the others to seek cover while trying to identify the source of American fire. Chun engaged immediately afterward, his precise shooting forcing enemy fighters to break contact and reconsider their approach. The firefight that followed was brief but intense. Elena's team held superior position but faced overwhelming numerical superiority that would eventually overrun their defenses. Taliban fighters maneuvered to flank their position, while maintaining suppressive fire that prevented effective counterattack. Martinez suddenly slumped against his boulder, blood spreading across his uniform shirt. "I'm hit," he reported with surprising calm, his medical training helping him assess his own condition. "Gut shot, probably serious." Elena immediately moved to provide medical treatment while Hayes and Chun maintained defensive fire. Martinez's wound was indeed serious, requiring immediate surgical intervention that Elena couldn't provide in the field. She administered morphine and applied pressure bandages, but his condition was deteriorating rapidly. The sound of approaching helicopter rotors echoed through the mountain valleys, just as Taliban fighters prepared for their final assault. Black Hawk 77 appeared over the southern ridge, its door gunners immediately engaging enemy positions with devastating effectiveness. The Taliban fighters who had been advancing on Elena's position suddenly found themselves taking fire from multiple directions. "Rodriguez, this is Black Hawk 77, the pilot transmitted. "We see your position and are taking heavy ground fire. Can you mark your location with smoke?" Elena threw her last smoke grenade, creating a purple cloud that identified friendly positions while the helicopter maneuvered for landing approach. Taliban fighters continued firing from concealed positions, but the helicopter's superior firepower was systematically eliminating enemy resistance. The extraction itself took less than 3 minutes, but felt like hours under enemy fire. Elena helped load Martinez first, his wounds requiring immediate medical attention that only the helicopter's flight medic could provide. Hayes followed, still conscious but requiring assistance to board the aircraft. Chun provided covering fire until the last moment, then jumped aboard as the helicopter lifted off. As Black Hawk 77 climbed away from the mountain stronghold, Elena looked down at the compound where she had found the missing soldiers. Taliban fighters were already evacuating the area, their positions compromised and their prisoners rescued. The mission that military doctrine had classified as impossible had been completed by a single medic, who refused to accept that following orders was more important than saving lives. During the flight back to FOB Crawford, Elena worked alongside the flight medic to stabilize Martinez's condition. His internal bleeding was serious but manageable with proper surgical intervention. Hayes remained conscious but disoriented, his head injury requiring careful monitoring for signs of brain trauma. Chun's shoulder wound was painful but not life-threatening, the infection responding well to antibiotic treatment. "Rodriguez," Hayes mumbled as Elena checked his bandages. "Why did you come for us?" Elena met his eyes with the steady gaze of someone who had risked everything for principles that couldn't be quantified in military regulations. "Because it was the right thing to do, sir." As FOB Crawford appeared in the distance, Elena realized that her unauthorized mission had succeeded beyond her most optimistic projections. All 3 members of Recon 7 were alive and would recover from their injuries. The Taliban stronghold had been compromised and would likely be abandoned. Most importantly, she had proven that individual initiative could achieve results that bureaucratic procedures couldn't match, but Elena also understood that her actions would have consequences that extended far beyond mission success. She had violated direct orders from a general officer, conducted unauthorized operations in enemy territory, and risked American lives based on her personal judgment rather than official authorization. Court-martial proceedings were virtually certain, and her military career was almost certainly over. The helicopter touched down at FOB Crawford's landing zone, where medical teams waited with stretchers and emergency equipment. As Elena helped transfer the wounded soldiers to waiting ambulances, she caught sight of General Hayes standing near the command tent. His expression was unreadable, but his presence at the landing zone suggested that their conversation would determine whether she faced courts-martial or commendation. Elena Rodriguez had spent 7 years learning that military service sometimes required choices between competing loyalties. Today, she had chosen to prioritize saving lives over following orders, and the consequences of that choice would define the remainder of her career. But as she watched Martinez being loaded into an ambulance that would take him to life-saving surgery, Elena knew she had made the right decision. Regardless of what happened next. 20-4 hours after the unauthorized rescue mission, Elena Rodriguez stood at attention in General Hayes's private office, her uniform crisp despite the bandages covering cuts from her mountain infiltration. The general sat behind his desk reviewing after-action reports while Elena waited for judgment that would determine her future in military service. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken tension about choices that had saved lives, while violating fundamental principles of military discipline. Elena understood that her actions created an impossible situation for the general. Rewarding her success would encourage other soldiers to disobey orders, but punishing her would send the message that saving American lives was less important. Then following procedures. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, General Hayes finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of command decisions that affected careers and lives. Your unauthorized mission violated direct orders, compromised operational security, and risked additional casualties through reckless individual action. Elena remained silent, accepting the criticism because it was technically accurate despite missing the larger context of her decision-making process. Military regulations existed to prevent exactly the kind of freelance operations she had conducted, regardless of their outcomes. However, the general continued, your actions also resulted in the successful recovery of 3 American soldiers who would likely have died without immediate medical intervention. The Taliban compound you neutralized contained intelligence materials that have already led to the capture of enemy leadership elements throughout the region. Elena processed this information while maintaining her position of attention. She hadn't known about the intelligence value of her target, having focused exclusively on medical evacuation of wounded personnel. The strategic implications of her mission were apparently more significant than she had realized. General Hayes stood and walked to the window overlooking Forward Crawford's main compound, where soldiers were conducting routine maintenance operations under the afternoon sun. His posture suggested internal conflict between personal gratitude and professional obligation. My son will make a full recovery, he said without turning around. The flight surgeon reports that another 12 hours without medical treatment would have resulted in permanent brain damage from his head injury. Your intervention quite literally saved his life. Elena understood that the general was sharing information that went beyond official military assessment. As a father, he was acknowledging debt that couldn't be repaid through normal channels. As a commanding officer, he was struggling with disciplinary requirements that seemed inadequate for unprecedented circumstances. Sir, I accept full responsibility for my actions and their consequences, Elena replied, maintaining military formality despite the personal nature of their conversation. I violated your direct orders and compromised mission security through individual decision-making. General Hayes turned from the window and studied Elena with the analytical gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating personnel under extreme conditions. What he saw was a soldier who had risked everything based on moral convictions, rather than personal advancement or glory-seeking. Rodriguez, in 26 years of military service, I have never encountered a more difficult command decision. The general admitted, your actions deserve both court-martial proceedings and the Medal of Honor, often for the same reasons. Elena remained silent while processing the implications of the general's statement. Military justice required consistent application of regulations, regardless of outcomes, but exceptional circumstances sometimes demanded flexibility that regulations couldn't anticipate. After extensive consultation with senior command elements, I have decided to recommend you for the Bronze Star with Valor device, General Hayes announced. Your citation will reflect heroic actions in rescuing wounded personnel under fire, with appropriate redaction of details regarding unauthorized departure from base. Elena felt a mixture of relief and confusion about the general's decision. She had expected court-martial proceedings, not commendation for actions that clearly violated military regulations. The disconnect between her expectations and reality suggested political considerations that extended beyond her individual case. Additionally, the general continued, You are being transferred to Fort Bragg for assignment with Special Operations Medical Units. Your demonstrated capability for independent action in hostile environments makes you valuable for missions that require medical personnel capable of operating without conventional support. Elena understood that her transfer represented both reward and exile. Special operations assignments offered professional advancement and challenging missions, but they also removed her from conventional units where her example might encourage other soldiers to question orders. The general was solving his disciplinary problem by promoting her away from situations where her influence could undermine military hierarchy. 3 weeks later, Elena reported to Fort Bragg's Special Operations Command, where her unauthorized rescue mission had become legendary among medical personnel who understood the tactical and ethical challenges she had faced. Her new commander, Colonel Sarah Mitchell, briefed her on assignment to units that conducted missions officially classified as training exercises, but which everyone understood involved real combat operations. Rodriguez, your Afghanistan operation demonstrated exactly the kind of initiative we need for unconventional medical support, Colonel Mitchell explained during Elena's initial briefing. Special operations medics operate independently in situations where following standard procedures often means mission failure or unnecessary casualties. Elena's new assignment involved training with units that conducted direct action missions, hostage rescue operations, and personnel recovery in denied territory. Her medical skills were enhanced with advanced trauma techniques, while her tactical capabilities were expanded through specialized courses in infiltration, weapons employment, and survival in hostile environments. 6 months after her transfer, Elena received a personal letter from Michael Hayes, now fully recovered and serving as a platoon leader with the 82nd Airborne Division. His message was brief but profound in its acknowledgement of what Elena had risked to save his life. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, my family owes you a debt that can never be repaid. Your courage under fire and dedication to saving lives exemplifies everything noble about military service. I hope to serve with the same integrity and selflessness that you demonstrated in Afghanistan. Elena kept the letter in her personal files alongside commendations for subsequent missions that remained classified, but which had established her reputation as one of the military's most capable special operations medics. Her career had been transformed by a single decision to prioritize moral obligation over military regulation, proving that individual actions could have consequences far beyond their immediate circumstances. Years later, when Elena taught advanced combat medicine to young medics preparing for their first deployments, she would emphasize the importance of technical competence and tactical awareness. But she would also discuss the moral complexities that soldiers faced when regulations conflicted with ethical obligations, using case studies that carefully avoided mentioning her own experience. Medical personnel have unique responsibilities that sometimes require difficult choices, she would tell her students. Your primary obligation is always to save lives, but you must also consider the broader implications of your actions for mission success and the safety of other soldiers. Elena's story became part of military medical folklore, though official records remained carefully sanitized to avoid encouraging unauthorized operations. Her example inspired a generation of combat medics who understood that exceptional circumstances sometimes demanded individual initiative that transcended normal procedural boundaries. The broader lesson of Elena Rodriguez's unauthorized mission extended beyond military medicine to fundamental questions about moral courage and individual responsibility. Her willingness to risk everything for principles that couldn't be quantified in regulations demonstrated that true leadership sometimes required rejecting authority in favor of higher ethical obligations. Elena had proven that strength wasn't always visible or officially recognized. Sometimes it manifested in quiet decisions made by individuals who refused to accept that following orders was more important than doing what was right. Her legacy reminded future generations of military personnel that moral courage was the foundation of all other virtues, even when exercising that courage carried devastating personal consequences. In the end, Elena Rodriguez had redefined what it meant to serve with honor. She had shown that military discipline and moral conviction could coexist, even when they appeared to conflict. Most importantly, she had demonstrated that individual actions, motivated by genuine concern for human life, could achieve results that bureaucratic procedures could never match. Her story continues to inspire soldiers who face impossible choices in dangerous places, reminding them that sometimes the right decision requires rejecting everything they have been taught about obedience in favor of everything they know about courage. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.